Hello and welcome to the audio lecture over Chapter 2 in our textbook. This chapter is called Choosing Your Words, and in this chapter we'll learn the importance of making careful word choice when we encode our messages so that we are transmitting them in as accurate a fashion as possible. Remember that each chapter in our book begins with a set of chapter objectives, and while I may not lecture on all of these things, these are the things that you can learn by reading and studying the chapter. So after studying the chapter, you should be able to do the following. You should be able to explain how language is symbolic, and we'll talk about how language is a system of symbols that we use to decode an idea and transmit it, and then the other person decodes the idea. We'll talk about the rules of language use and how we put ideas and sentences together. We'll look at the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis and how language and culture are related. In other words, how does the culture you come from influence the way you communicate? We'll look at how cultural differences can create communication noise and prevent messages from being understood. We'll explain the relationship between language and gender, or the differences between how men and women communicate. We'll look at I and we language and how those are used. We'll differentiate between the denotative and connotative meanings of words. We'll examine something called politeness theory and how, if we want to communicate effectively, we need to help the other person to save face or keep their dignity. We'll look at methods of persuasion such as ethos, logos, and pathos. And we'll look at abuses of language, wrong ways of using language, and how those can hinder effective communication. Again, I might not address every one of these in this video lecture, but you can read more about them in the chapter. Let's begin with the idea that language is symbolic, or a language is a symbol system, and the speakers and users of that language learn what symbols go with what things in order to be able to communicate about the world around them. So as an example, look at this item in the picture. In English, we call this a window, but I've provided you with a list of window translated into other languages, some which use the same kind of alphabet that we do, and some that use a different alphabet like Hebrew, Arabic, and Japanese. But users of those languages learn that those particular symbols mean this thing. So we need to choose symbols that our receiver is going to be able to decode properly. And even within a language, a symbol can have multiple meanings, so we need to make our choices judiciously. Word meaning connection is somewhat arbitrary. Why do we call a window and not a shoe or a sock? Why do the French call a window a fenêtre and we say window? The connection is somewhat arbitrary. If you study linguistics, you'll study the evolution of words, the origin and evolution over time of how words are used. So there is some reason behind it, but in many cases it is arbitrary. Consider the fact that we invent new words. So words can mean whatever we as users of a language choose for them to mean. When we invent a new product, we invent a new word. Things like internet are new words to the English language within the past 50 years or so. So we must ask the question, do we modify the English language constantly, or should we keep with traditional meanings and grammar? And you'll find arguments on both sides of that question. Those who say the English language should stay the same will say that structure allows us to be understood, and working within structure enhances our chances of being understood. But those who are in favor of allowing language to change and evolve will say that we need to apply words in new and different ways to express new and different ideas. And I'll give you an example. When I was growing up, I was taught when I write or speak to say he as the generic pronoun. So a sentence would be like, every student should buy the textbook so that he can do the readings. That was considered a proper sentence. The word he was considered to be a generic pronoun. Now, of course, feminists take issue with that and encourage the use of he or she. Recently, we've come to use the word they as a generic pronoun. So the sentence, students should buy the textbook so that they can do the readings, would be considered a grammatically correct sentence to many people. A traditionalist would say it's wrong. A traditionalist would say that the word they is plural. But the word they as a general pronoun meaning one person is coming into more popular use. So that's the dilemma of whether we should stick with traditional meanings in grammar or be willing to evolve and broaden our understanding of word meaning connection. This means that language is both static and dynamic. Static means staying the same. It means something is frozen in time. Dynamic means something is energetic and vibrant and ever-changing. So language can be viewed in both of these ways. If we want to be effective communicators, it's important that we understand the multiple meanings of various words. I mentioned language rules and rules of grammar and meaning. Well, what are these? There are 4 kinds of language rules that we'll study in this chapter, and these are called phonological rules, semantic rules, syntactic rules, and pragmatic rules. And in the coming moments, I will explain each one of these in turn. So don't worry, each of these will get their own slides coming up. Let's start with phonological rules, or rules about pronunciation. These vary by language. If you're familiar with foreign languages in writing, you may have noticed that some of them have different accent marks or little markings above and below the letters that tell us that they need to be pronounced in different ways. Some languages have a more guttural tone behind them than English does. So it's hard to learn a language phonetically, and that means it's hard to learn a language applying your own pronunciation rules, applying the pronunciation rules of English to another language. So you might be familiar with the play Les Miserables or the movie. And if you looked at the title of that and tried to pronounce it according to the rules of English, it would be Les Miserables. But we can't use our own phonological rules with another language. So we need to learn both the rules and the meanings. Garage is another word that illustrates this pretty well for me. I say garage. I've heard this word pronounced both garage and garage by different people. I grew up in Michigan. I've spent a lot of my time in the Upper Peninsula right near the Canadian border, and I've seen Canadian friends pronounce this garage. And the first time someone said to me, "Can I park in your garage?" I didn't know what they were talking about, because they were not following the phonological rules of American English. So following the language rules of the person we're talking to can enhance our chance of being decoded correctly. Semantic rules, or semantics, are simply rules about meaning, the agreed upon meanings in a given language or context. So this is the connection between the symbol and the thing that it's supposed to represent. And of course, these are going to differ by language and context. For example, even within the same language, a word can have multiple meanings that change with context. And I'll give you this example. The word read. How should it be pronounced and understood? Well, it depends on the context. If I write down the sentence, I must read my book, you are going to interpret that as I am going to do something actively. I'm going to read my book. But if I write down, I read my book, that means I did it in the past. The word is spelled the same way in both of those cases, but it's going to mean something different and be interpreted differently depending on the context in which it appears. So those things are called semantics. Syntactic rules or syntax are rules about word order. What order do words go in a sentence in order to convey the meaning properly within that symbol system? So every language has its own syntactic rules. If you speak a second language, you might be aware that in some languages an adjective comes before a noun, in others it comes after a noun, and whether or not that changes the meaning of the sentence. Here are a couple of examples. Coat warm versus warm coat. Well, in this case, the syntax doesn't really matter a lot, because if someone whose first language was not English said to you, I need to buy a coat warm for this winter, you would understand what they meant, even though the syntax was incorrect. They meant warm coat. Reversing the words, though, doesn't really change the meaning of the sentence. But look at this second example. I left him versus he left me. In that case, the word order does matter because it changes the meaning of the sentence if we put the words in the wrong order. So in this case, whether the subject of the sentence is myself or the other person makes a difference to the meaning of the sentence. So every language has its own syntactic rules that speakers need to learn. And the fourth kind of language rule we'll examine in this chapter is pragmatic rules, or how you should interpret certain words or phrases. And this is usually very culturally connected. So some examples of pragmatic rules that might help you to understand this better. How are you? We say that to each other all the time when you greet someone. Hey, how are you? Are we really asking how they are? Is it really an inquiry about their health? Do we really want them to spend 10 minutes telling us about their lives? No, we usually say, fine, how are you? The pragmatic rule for interpreting how are you, for decoding that, is that it's usually just a throwaway greeting. And speakers of English usually understand that. Another example would be see you later. If you're talking to somebody and you say, okay, see you later, are you really going to see that person later that day, later that week? Not necessarily. It's a way of saying goodbye that we are all familiar with. So you might meet someone for the very first time. Say you're talking to a friend and another person walks up and your friend introduces you to this person who was a stranger to you before. And you chat for a few minutes and then they say, okay, well, I gotta go. And you say, okay, see you later. Are you really going to see that person later? Maybe or maybe not, but we understand that it's a way of saying goodbye. So we have lots of words and phrases in English that kind of have a secondary meaning that we understand, that we need to interpret these phrases in these ways. So as we make our choices to render a thought into a symbol system or a language in order to convey it to somebody else, we want to consider the effect that might have on them. Will they be able to decode it the way that we mean it? We want to be understood. Should we therefore stick to more traditional semantic and syntactic rules. Perhaps with someone who's speaking English as a second language, more traditional ways of expressing ourselves would be easier for them to decode. We also want to manage our emotion and manage the relationship through our word choices. So we want to be aware of what kinds of words and expressions are likely to evoke negativity in other people and be judicious in using those. And we'll talk about that a little more in a few minutes when we look at how profanity affects others. Word choice can be extra challenging when words have multiple meanings or different meanings in different contexts. For example, is a diner a person or place? Is a date today's day, such as if it's June 15th, or is that meeting with someone in a possibly romantic context? Engagement. You could be engaged to be married, or you could say, I can't attend that meeting because I have an engagement later, just meaning an activity to do. Leaves. They grow on trees, and we also leave a room. Rose. He picked a rose from the garden, or he rose from his seat. Type. Are you my type? Maybe I'll type you a letter then, right? So being aware of how these multiple meanings, these ambiguous words could confuse others, and possibly making an alternative choice in these cases can enhance our ability to be understood correctly. When we're choosing our words and we're dealing with conversational partners who might have different native languages, the issue of translation versus interpretation becomes important. And we tend to use these words interchangeably, but they do mean different things. Translation means to render a thought literally from one language into another, whereas interpretation means to render the meaning into the other language, possibly using different words that will explain it. Let me give you an example. Think about the phrase white as snow. You might say in English that something was white as snow. Now, you could render that literally into another language. Say you're rendering it into a language of someone who lives in the tropics and has never been outside of their place of origin. So you tell them that something is white as snow in their language. You've translated it, you've rendered that phrase literally into their language, but they may not understand you if they're not familiar with snow, if they've never seen snow. So you might want to use interpretation instead and say that something is white as milk. Now, milk might be something that they're familiar with. So you're conveying your same meaning, but you're having to use different words in order to do so. Let's look at a couple fun examples of translation versus interpretation. I really like both of these. I find them fun. On the left, we have Kummerspeck. Kummerspeck in German is literally translated grief bacon. But the meaning of Kummerspeck is excess weight gained from emotional overeating. So I think about my friend who ate an entire cheesecake after she broke up with her boyfriend. The weight she gained from that would be Kummerspeck. But we say literally it's grief bacon. That's not something that an American or an native English speaker would probably understand. So in this case, we need to interpret. We need to go beyond just literal translation and give an interpretation. The one on the right, l'esprit d'escalier. French is my second language, and I love this phrase. L'esprit d'escalier, if you translate it literally, it means staircase wit. But if you said to an American or a native English speaker, I felt like I lacked staircase wit earlier today, or that I had staircase wit earlier today, they're not going to understand what you mean. But l'esprit d'escalier could be interpreted as the feeling you get when you leave a conversation and think of all the things you should have said. Now, haven't we all experienced that? After the conversation is over and you walked away, you think of that great comeback you should have made. That feeling is l'esprit d'escalier, which is staircase wit. So the literal translation isn't always helpful, but the interpretation can help us to get our meaning across and have it decoded in the way that we intended. Let's examine the relationship between context and culture. And I want to emphasize the difference between low context cultures and high context cultures. I encourage you to read this section of the book carefully because high and low work the opposite way you might think they do. Low context cultures, of which the United States is one, and most of Western society is, are cultures where the way we use language is pretty straightforward, pretty literal. You can trust the written and spoken word and interpret it without a lot of extra cues. So the meaning doesn't change depending on a gesture or a tone of voice or a raised eyebrow or something like that. We trust the written and spoken word. So low context cultures like the US, we tend to say what we mean and mean what we say. In low context cultures, contracts can be quite specific and lengthy because we believe that you need to get things in writing and interpret the words literally. High context cultures, on the other hand, are cultures where you do have to rely on a lot of extraneous cues in the environment in order to interpret the messages correctly. Examples of high context cultures are often given as Asian countries. An example I've heard of a high context situation is one where an American speaker was addressing a Japanese audience, the Japanese audience being a high context culture. At the end of her talk, she asked if there were any questions. Nobody raised their hand, so she assumed there were no questions. And the person who was facilitating the talk said, "I think there are questions. You in the third row in the green sweater, what is your question?" And the person did have a question. And so the facilitator picked out different people and invited them to ask a question. And the American speaker didn't understand what was happening there. And the facilitator told her, "Well, you've got to learn to read the room." He said he could tell by the way people were sitting forward in their seats or making eye contact or just by their facial expressions that they did have a question. But the American, coming from a low context culture, would have expected people to raise their hands because that's the kind of thing we do in a low context culture. We put ourselves forward. We say what we mean. If you say, "Do you have a question?" I say, "Yes, I have a question." Whereas in a high context culture, you may have to interpret other cues in the environment in order to decode the messages correctly. So consider how this can cause noise in the system and can cause conflict between people who come from these different cultures. Those of us who come from low context cultures might be considered rude, and we might look at people from high context cultures as being vague or not saying what they mean. And this can result in some conflict in understanding. A linguistic theory that examines the connection between context and culture is called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis basically examines the idea that the culture that you come from determines the way you encode and decode messages. So the language that you speak and the ways that people behave in your native surroundings are going to make a difference in how you encode and decode messages. Two elements of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis are linguistic determinism and linguistic relativity. So let me explain each one of these. Let's start with linguistic determinism. Take the words and tear apart the meaning. Linguistic means having to do with language. Determinism, something's determining something. Linguistic determinism means we can conceive of something only if we have a word for it. So let me give you an example. Imagine that you bought a pair of shoes, and these shoes are a particular color. They're turquoise. And you are speaking to someone who doesn't have a word for the color turquoise in their native language. You tell them, I bought a pair of turquoise shoes. They are unable to decode that message and have a picture in their mind of what your shoes look like because they don't have a word for that color in their language. That's the idea of linguistic determinism, that we can conceive of something only if we have a word for it. Go back to the translation versus interpretation I was talking about a minute ago, and that German word Kummerspeck. We don't have a word for that in English. Grief bacon, we don't understand what that means. We don't have a word that directly translates Kummerspeck. So we can't understand what it means without interpretation. That's the idea behind linguistic determinism, that if we don't have a word for it, we can't envision it or understand it. Linguistic relativity is a different idea. Linguistic, again, having to do with language. Relativity, things are relative to each other. So linguistic relativity is the idea that people who speak different languages are going to perceive the world differently. Let me give you a couple of examples. If your language reads from right to left, as do Hebrew and Arabic, if I ask you to arrange some objects in order of size, you may arrange them from right to left, whereas an English speaker will tend to arrange them from left to right. That's a direct effect of the language you speak, affecting the way you see the world. A couple of other examples I can give you. In French, the phrase j'ai faim, which is the first set of words in parentheses here. In English, we say I'm hungry. In French, you say j'ai faim, which translates I have hunger. So to an English speaker, I am hungry. Hungry is something I am. It's a state I'm in. It's a condition. Whereas to a French speaker who says j'ai faim, I have hunger, it's something they have, not something they are. It's not a state they're in. It's something that they possess at the moment. It's a very subtle difference, but it can change the way you see things. A better example, perhaps, a more understandable example, is languages that have a formal and informal form of you, the pronoun you. If you speak another language, you might be familiar with this idea of formal and informal you. French is my second language. The formal you is vous. The informal you is tu. Spanish also has a formal and informal you. Some languages have even more than two forms. If you speak English and you're used to saying you to everybody, right? Your parent, a stranger, an old person, a young person, a baby, everybody's you. You. The idea of linguistic relativity, that would say that that drives us to think more in terms of equality. Whereas a language that has a formal and informal form of you forces us to think about our relationship with that person before we talk. So if I want to say it's nice to see you In French, I have to choose whether I'm going to use the formal you, which is used for strangers or people who are more important than me, or the informal form of you, which you tend to use mostly with family, friends, or people who are inferior to you. So my choice of the pronoun you forces me to evaluate my relationship to that person before I speak, and therefore that would, according to the idea of linguistic relativity, force me to see the world as composed of different groups of yous. There are the yous that I have to speak formally to and that are not my peers, and there are the yous that I can speak informally to who are my peers or my inferiors. So if you do speak a second language that has a formal and informal form of you, consider this idea that you have to choose every time, and that could drive the way that you perceive the world and perceive other people. Many words have multiple meanings, and these meanings could be denotative or connotative. Denotative meanings are the literal definition of the word. I usually remember dictionary definition. Denotative starts with a D, dictionary starts with a D. So I think the denotative meaning is the dictionary definition of the word. Connotative meanings are a secondary meaning of the word that is contextual and often cultural, that might be different from the denotative meaning. But when we use a word in that way, we expect the other person to understand what we mean. So let me give you an example. First, I'll direct you to the example in the book. If we say someone has a lot of baggage, the dictionary definition of baggage is, suitcases, things to carry things in. But if we say that person has a lot of baggage, the connotative meaning of that is they have a lot of problems. They have a lot of worries or burdens on their mind, right? Another example of a difference between denotative and connotative meaning is slang. Think of the word sick. If we say something is sick, well, the dictionary definition, the denotative meaning of sick is illness. But a connotative meaning of sick is a positive thing. If I say, oh, your new outfit is really sick. You look sick in that outfit, or listen to this sick new song. And again, a lot of slang words are contextual, and that might be out of style by the time you listen to this video. But it's a good example of how that word has a completely different meaning in the context and in a particular culture. So again, this raises a challenge for people when they are speaking and listening, when they're encoding and decoding in a language or a context that they're not familiar with. Because you might say something to a person using the connotative meaning, and they might decode it using the denotative meaning, and understanding will not have taken place. So consider the denotative and connotative meanings of some of the words that we use in everyday speech. Let's examine the relationship between gender and communication. And we're considering gender to be performative, so whether a person performs maleness or performs femaleness in their interactions in the world. It may or may not correspond with their biological sex. But gendered communication is this idea that people performing maleness or masculinity communicate in a different way than people performing femaleness or femininity. We're painting with broad strokes here. These are generalizations. These may be considered stereotypes, but it's important to understand the difference between instrumental and expressive communication. Instrumental communication is usually connected with maleness or male forms of expression. Instrumental communication is communicating to accomplish something. So please pass the salt, or Will you hand me that book? Straightforward requests or directions like that are considered instrumental. It's communication intended to accomplish a specific thing. Expressive communication is connected with emotion. It is usually associated with people performing femaleness, and expressive communicators will get together and talk about emotion and feelings without necessarily having an instrumental element to it. So, for example, guys might get together to talk about the football game. Women might get together to just talk and talk about emotion and all kinds of meandering topics and express more feeling and thought and emotion about those topics than those performing maleness do. So again, these are generalities, but in general, those performing maleness engage in more instrumental conversation. Those performing femaleness engage in more expressive conversation. That leads us into the idea of gender roles, or what are the norms for behavior in our culture that we have prescribed for people performing masculinity versus people performing femininity. And we might say that a particular person has a masculine or feminine communication style. That may or may not conform to their gender or their biological sex, but we associate certain ways of communicating with men or with women. Assertiveness versus gentleness, for example, might be considered gendered communication styles. And again, these depend on the social norms that we have. We talked about norms and scripts in the last chapter. Here's an example. Look at these magazine covers. These magazines were on the newsstand side by side. They're called Girls' Life and Boys' Life. But consider the gender roles and norms that each of these is pointing us to. The Girls' Life magazine has blurbs on the cover about fashion and hair, kissing a boy, how to avoid drama with your friends, how to wake up pretty. This communicates to us that these are the concerns of a young person performing femininity. These are the things that they're supposed to care about according to our cultural norms. If you look at the Boys' Life magazine, look at the stuff on the cover there. Explore your future. And it has pictures of a firefighter's helmet, a police officer's badge, a microscope, an airplane, different things like that. So this communicates to boys what they're supposed to care about, right? What does a young person performing masculinity focus on? Well, according to this, they focus on their future career, and these are all these different options available to them. We don't see any of this career stuff on the girls' magazine cover. So these are interesting cultural artifacts to examine and consider what they say about our social norms and what we are trying to tell young people what it means to be feminine or masculine. When we're choosing our words and we're trying to persuade somebody, we might use some of these persuasion techniques. We might use them alone or in combination with one another. Ethos, logos, and pathos are three different persuasion techniques. These go back to the days of Aristotle, so you might notice that the words are Greek. If you've ever taken a public speaking course and you had to make a persuasive speech, you may have encountered these three words or this set of ideas before. So if I want to persuade you to listen to me about something, I might use an ethos appeal, a logos appeal, a pathos appeal. Ethos has to do with me, my character. This is me saying you should listen to me because of who I am. You should listen to me because I'm a good person. You should listen to me because I'm an educated person. I'm trying to convince you that you should believe my message and be persuaded because of who the message is coming from, and that's me. And that I am a person that you should believe and listen to. Logos is using reason or logic to persuade someone. So when we're using a logos appeal, we give reasons for things. We might cite sources. We might talk about expert testimony. We're trying to build a case through logic and reason. Pathos is a persuasion technique that tries to appeal to emotion, that tries to arouse an emotion in you to persuade you. One of the best examples of a pathos appeal is commercials on TV that you see for animal shelters, where they're showing a lot of sad, injured animals, and they're playing sad music in the background, and a narrator is telling you that these poor dogs and cats are going to die unless you send money to help support them. That's a pathos appeal. Or the commercials that we see for children's hospitals that try to tug at your heartstrings by showing you their families and the kids and how they're struggling with disease and trying to get well. That's using a pathos or emotional appeal to arouse emotion in you that will lead you to be persuaded. Now, you can use these persuasion techniques separately or together. Many times we use them in a stepwise fashion. Like we'll start with ethos. If you've ever made a speech in a public speaking class, you might have been asked to start with explaining why you are a good person to be talking about this. What authority do you have to be talking about this subject? When I tell my students about my background and my education, that could be considered an ethos appeal. Logos, we usually try to build our arguments by referring to experts or outside sources from ourselves. And then pathos, you might end by saying, if you want to change the world, make a difference, be a good person, you should do this. So we might choose all three of these methods. And speaking of ethos, our word choice can affect whether other people perceive us to be credible or not, the extent to which others perceive us to be competent and trustworthy. If we choose the wrong words, or we use slang, or we use too much profanity, that could have an effect on whether somebody else perceives us to be competent. Several forms of language can either enhance or diminish our credibility. Cliches are one type of word choice that can diminish your credibility. If you use the same cliches all the time or use them too much. I encourage you to look at the Lake Superior State University banished words list. It's a lot of fun. Every year they post a list of words that should be banished from the English language, and they're very much cliched and overused, and just kind of make you roll your eyes or groan when you hear them. And they're a good example of the kinds of words that could diminish somebody's credibility if they use them too much. You've probably heard people say things like, think outside the box, think outside the box, think outside the box. It's a cliche. If you overuse it, people are not going to be as impressed with you. I used to have a boss who always used the phrase thought process. Let me tell you my thought process on this. What is your thought process? Joe told me his thought process, to the point where you just kind of wanted to cross your eyes and scream when you heard the phrase. That's an example of a cliche diminishing his credibility, or at least my desire to listen to him. Dialects. We sometimes associate regional accents or regional word choices with credibility. We might consider someone to be like us or unlike us depending on those regional accents or word choices. Do you call a soft drink soda or pop? That might affect someone else's perception of your competence depending on what region you are in. A lot of newscasters or actors try to cultivate what they call standard American speech, SAM, which is an unaccented American speech. If they come from regions where they have a strong accent, a lot of them try to work that accent out of their speaking so they will be more widely accepted. Now, I grew up in Michigan. I know I have what they call the nasal Midwestern accent. Interestingly, when I was studying at Ohio University for my PhD, a lot of people down there thought I was Canadian. And I spent a lot of years in Sault Ste. Marie, right on the US-Canada border. And when I taught at Lake Superior State University, a lot of my students were Canadian. So apparently growing up in a border area might have added some Canadian mannerisms to the way I talk, but that might have caused people to think I was more or less credible than the way native Ohioans spoke, which many of them spoke with a bit of a southern twang to my ear. There was a little bit of southernness, I thought, in the way many southern Ohio natives spoke. And again, these regional accents can affect the way we think of other people. And then the third one here, equivocation or strategic ambiguity, which means you're being purposely vague. And the reason I have the word references here is that sometimes when we're giving employment references, we do this. We are deliberately vague. If somebody calls me and asks about a student and they're thinking of hiring that person and they want to see if I think they would be a good employee, and maybe I thought that student didn't get along very well with other students and they turned in all their assignments late and their assignments were not well done, and I didn't think very positively of that person. But when I'm asked for an employment reference, if I were using strategic ambiguity, I might say something like, he had a perfect attendance record. He never missed class. I'm trying to say something positive about this person that might be related to their higher ability on this job, but I'm also leaving a lot out. I'm being strategically ambiguous. I'm being purposely vague about certain things. So equivocation, if someone suspects that you're doing it, that could also affect their perception of your competence. Politicians do this all the time. Watch a politician in a press conference. They're asked a question. Oftentimes they don't answer the question they were asked. It's equivocation. They're trying to kind of divert your attention by being deliberately vague. In addition to conveying meaning, our language choices can arouse emotion in our receiver. Emotions such as our language could comfort them, could agitate them, could offend them. So we want to be aware of the possible effects of certain kinds of language choices. And if we are going to agitate or offend or arouse a negative emotion, at least we're doing so knowingly and deliberately. So let's look at some of these language choices that can arouse emotion. Language choice can arouse emotion in your receiver, your conversational partner. Here's a list of some kinds of language choices that are likely to arouse emotion. First, humor. Why is a joke funny? Well, because it has a punchline. So a punchline is that little zinger at the end where you've been telling them a little story and then you say something at the end that's surprising. It violates their expectations. And that makes a person laugh or groan or have some kind of other emotional reaction. But sometimes humor is inappropriate. Sometimes a joke is inappropriate. So we want to use humor judiciously. When somebody's really sensitive about something, humor might not be appropriate. We use euphemisms sometimes to be more sensitive to other people about difficult things. For example, if somebody dies, we might say they passed away. If somebody loses their job or got fired, we might say, oh, he was let go. And we're trying to be sensitive to the emotion of those events, but we can also desensitize ourselves by using too many euphemisms. So again, we should use them judiciously and be aware of the effect they might have. Slang. The use of slang designates you as part of an in-group or an out-group, assuming the in-group understands the slang and the out-group does not understand the slang. So if you're talking to somebody and you use a slang expression that they don't understand, you are labeling them as part of an out-group. You are deliberately not connecting with them if you make that choice. So consider whether or not the person is likely to know the slang expression when you use it. Defamation, defaming somebody. There's two kinds, libel and slander. You've probably heard these words before, but sometimes people don't quite understand the difference between them. Libel, I always think libel equals label. I like to use mnemonic devices, don't I? Libel equals label, a label is written. So libel is written defamation, whereas slander, S, is spoken, S. Slander is spoken. In both cases, this means that you say or write something that harms somebody else's reputation or integrity, that defames them. Hate speech. Hate speech is related to demographics. It is related to people in a certain demographic group. So when you say something negative about women, or you say something negative about members of a certain minority group, or you say something negative about people who live in a certain region, saying something negative about people that's related to a demographic about them is considered hate speech. So you want to be careful of saying, well, all people from that part of the country believe such and such. Making those generalizations, those can be considered hate speech. Profanity. Profanity is an interesting type of word choice. Profanity varies from language to language, of course. So, for example, Brits, people who speak British English will say the word bloody. You know, that show I went to was bloody boring. That is a swear word to Brits in a way that it isn't to Americans. If you say to an American something's bloody, we think covered in blood. So profanity is very cultural. But the interesting thing is profanity lights up the amygdala. There's a gland in your brain that reacts with fight or flight syndrome that releases adrenaline that triggers fear, and that gland reacts when you hear a profane word. So if you're a person who drops F-bombs all the time, and someone tells you that they don't like it, they find it upsetting, they are actually having a mental and physical reaction to hearing those words, because those words trigger our brain to feel threatened. So again, profanity is something, I'm not saying to never use it, but to use it judiciously and use it with awareness of how it could be interpreted and the emotions it could arouse in your conversational partner. Politeness theory suggests that we try to save our own and others' face through acts of politeness. In other words, when we want to positively connect with somebody and positively communicate with somebody, we're going to try to preserve their sense of integrity. We're not going to embarrass them. We try not to embarrass ourselves or other people when we want to connect with them. So we choose words and phrases that will preserve their face or their sense of integrity and their sense of not being embarrassed or humiliated. And politeness theory talks about a number of kinds of face. We're going to look at 3 here. The first of these is competence face. So think about what competence means, that you're skilled at doing something, right? You're good at doing something. So if I want to preserve your competence face, I'm going to acknowledge that you know this thing already, or that you're good at doing this thing. We want to acknowledge the dignity of another person's level of skill at something. We don't want to talk down to people or over-explain something that they are likely to already know. Autonomy face. Think about what autonomy means. It means independence. So we want to preserve our sense and other people's sense of independence. So that might mean you don't jump in and offer to help when you know they want or need to do something for themselves or by themselves, because they want to be seen as able to do something by themselves. Sometimes when you're teaching someone how to do something, you have to allow them to struggle with it a little bit and not blurt out the answer in order to help save their autonomy face. And then fellowship face. Fellowship face is your sense of being friendly and being worthy of friendship. The idea that other people like you and that you're worthy of being liked. So we want to feel that way ourselves, that we're likable, and we want to preserve that feeling for other people in order to boost their confidence and boost a positive sense of emotion through interacting with us. Those are some highlights of Chapter 2. Be sure to ask your instructors if you have any questions, and we'll talk to you in the next chapter.